and then move forward from. Okay. Now the thing is that in yesterday's class, we talked about how is GDP, right? Is GDP, the actual question that we looked at, is GDP a good indicator of development, right? So what we mean here is that we know what is development. Development is the quality of life. We look at how high or how high or how low is the quality of life in any country, right? But is GDP able to capture that thing or not, which is national income? We know that GDP is national income. So is GDP a good indicator of development or not? That's what we talked about yesterday, like Master Ahmed Bab, right? And then what we said, think about it. So we already know GDP in, we discussed GDP in detail in the class before yesterday, right? And in that we said GDP is national income, which is basically income of all the people who are living in the country. Then we also talked about other national income statistics, right? Which we will not revise again because that would be too much, right? So national income statistics are basically different measures or different calculations, 4 indicators we talked about that are used to calculate the national income of a country. So national income statistics are calculations used to calculate the national income or the total income of all the people who are living in a country, right? So that include 4 things. What were those? GDP, gross domestic product. Then you had net domestic product, NDP, net domestic product. Then you had gross national product, GNP, gross national product. And lastly, you had net national product, right? So these are the 4 national income statistics. But the most common of these 4, we already know, the most common of these 4 is GDP, right? Which is income of people living within the country, income of people living in the country, right? Okay, now is GDP a good indicator of development? Yes, no, why yes, why no, and all that stuff. So we'll talk about that. Okay, now students, have a look at this. Okay, so think about this. We said we will make 2 columns. Yes, how is it a good indicator, and no, how is it not a good indicator? Now you have to pay close attention, even if you were here in the class yesterday, because we're about to quickly recap. We do know that if GDP is increasing, this means that the income of a country is increasing. When GDP is increasing, the income of a country is increasing, right? Which means what? That now people on average will have higher incomes, which mean that they will be able to buy more goods and services, right? So to some extent, GDP can be an indicator of development. To some extent, GDP can be an indicator of development. Why? Because higher incomes, right? Higher incomes do help in achieving, in buying and affording more goods and services, right? Indicator of development, right? Because higher incomes do help people to afford better education, healthcare, and all that stuff, right? Is this simple? Is this clear? Okay. But on the no side, there was a long list, right? So the only argument that we gave on the yes side, that GDP can be a good indicator of development because it helps, because it calculates national income, and national income is like higher incomes are needed to buy better quality education, to buy better quality healthcare, to have better quality, more purchasing power. Exactly, more purchasing power or more spending power. Excellent, right? But on the no side, we said that GDP is not a good indicator of development. Why? It does not, now you have to listen to this very carefully. First of all, it does not specify what type of goods are being produced. With every point, I'll give you an explaining example so that it helps you to better understand. Does not specify what goods and services are being produced. What goods and services are being produced, right? So basically, think about this. Whether a country is producing more education, and that's why its GDP is increasing, or a country is producing more military goods like defense equipment, and that is why the GDP is increasing. So you can't really tell whether the GDP is higher because of really you are really producing things that are needed for the development of a country, or you are producing things that will not directly help in the development. Now we all know that obviously military goods are important, but those military goods or defense equipment doesn't directly contribute to the development of a country. Are you getting me? As much as education, as much as healthcare contribute to the development. Yes or no, right? So that's the problem. It does not specify what goods and services are being produced. So that is why it cannot be a good indicator of development. Another thing, another problem with GDP not being a good indicator of development is that does not account for the exhaustion of resources or the depletion of resources that take place. And explain you this point as well. Does not account for depletion. So it doesn't tell us how much depletion took place, depletion of resources took place when the country produced this much GDP. Now, why is this important? Let me tell you. Right? Think about this. Whenever you produce more goods and services, right? What happens? You need to use more resources. Whenever there is, whenever a country is producing more goods and services, you need to use more resources. Now, there are few resources that cannot be, that are non-renewable, right? So non-renewable resources like all the fossil fuels, coal, oil, and so on and so forth, those cannot be increased. Right? Those are non-renewable. Then there's some renewable and non-renewable. Okay. Now the thing is, if you are producing more goods and services at the expense of non-renewable resources, right? So if you're growing growing a country by using mainly non-renewable resources. So easiest example that I gave you yesterday was, let's say Pakistan discovers a huge coal reserve. Now coal and oil are all non-renewable resources, and that coal reserve is good enough for us to produce electricity for the next 20 years. So we are good, we are safe, we are right, and we use that coal to produce electricity for the next 20 years. But then after that, if we haven't figured out, right, after that, if we haven't figured out how we will produce electricity after that, then it will be a problem for us. Students, are you getting me? So that's why GDP doesn't tell you whether the growth was sustainable, because some countries are doing sustainable growth, which means that they are growing, but they're not fully exhausting their non-renewable resources. They're very smart. They're also conserving some resources. Like, in the case of electricity, all the big countries of the world have already started thinking and using alternate sources of energy. So they don't rely on fossil fuel. They're making electricity through wind. They're making electricity through, what is that called? Solar energy and blah, 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 right? Are you getting? Even biofuels are being used and so on, right? So coming back to the point, GDP doesn't tell whether the country had sustainable growth or unsustainable growth. So that's why another reason why GDP is not a good indicator. So here we are talking about why GDP is not a good indicator of development. Another problem with GDP is doesn't show, right, does not account for the amount of pollution. Again, this is linked to the above point, does not account for the pollution that took place during during more production of goods and services. Does not account for the pollution that took place right, that took place while you were producing more goods and services, right? Very good, excellent. Isha, are you understanding this, right? Is this clear? If there's any point that you find difficult, do ask me. Okay, now it doesn't account for, or it doesn't show, GDP doesn't show why, how much pollution took place while you were producing more goods and services. Okay, we can consider these, great, perfect, as disadvantages of GDP as well. I mean, yes, but be clear on this about that these are technically not disadvantages of using GDP as an indicator of development. Otherwise, GDP is a good statistic to calculate national income, and that is what its purpose is. So GDP's purpose is to calculate, that thing, the national income of a country. But if you use it as an indicator of development, yes, then these are all the disadvantages, or these are all the problems, shortcomings, as we say, right? Limitations, shortcomings, and so on. Okay, I'll go to this. Then another thing, doesn't explicitly account for goods and services that directly contribute to the development of a country. For instance, let me give you some examples. Goods and services that directly contribute, directly contribute to country's development, like like education, healthcare, how much was spent on, you know, social welfare, infrastructure, right? Education, healthcare, infrastructure, welfare, right? Welfare projects and so on and so forth. Infrastructure, structure, and welfare projects. And obviously, it's not a complete list. There are so many other things that directly contribute to the development of people in a country, but that products or those things are not included in the GDP calculation. Are we getting this? Right. It was something similar. It was something similar above. So it was the last point that we wrote was something similar, that GDP doesn't include things that directly contribute to countries' development. Like for instance, how much is the positive things, or how much even are the negative things in a country, right? Crime rate, exactly. So I meant the same, right? So it's two way of looking at it. So GDP doesn't tell you explicitly that how many of the goods and services that you produced were directly contributing to the welfare of the country, and how many of the goods and services that you produced were, you know, just there to control bad things. Like if there is more crime rate, now listen to this, this is very interesting. If there is more crime rate, what do a country needs to do? To control more crime rate, what will the country need to do? Quickly, what will the country need to do? Come on. What ideas are coming to your mind? What a country would need to do if there is more crime rate taking place? Develop more, you know, deploy more police, right? Laws are obviously important, but to control that, you need more police members. So when you hire more police members, even the GDP would still go up. Even the GDP would still go up. Yes or no? Are you getting me? So the GDP would still go up, right? But the thing is that this GDP, or this amount of services, or, you know, this spending that you spend on police was not really increasing the quality of life. That was just there to control the bad thing happening in the country. That was just there to control the bad thing happening in the country. Students, are you getting it? Right? So these are all the things that you need to understand. Okay. Right. I have never taught accounting. I've studied accounting, but I've never taught accounting. Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So why so? Okay. Is this clear, students? Is this clear? We have a good accounting teacher, by the way, at Mega Lecture. So if you want help, he can help you out with that. Right. Okay. Are we good on this? Right. Okay. Now these are all the problems because of which GDP is not a good indicator of development. So are you getting me? Right. Then comes the main point, which is the our discussion for today's class, that if GDP is not a good indicator of development, then what are good indicators of development, right? We need to know how much a country is developing, because this entire topic, from the very first day I told you that this entire topic is about growth versus development, right? So if growth versus development, right? So if growth is measured by all the national income statistics that we looked at, GDP is one of them, and GDP is not a good indicator for development. Okay, we got it, we understood, we had a discussion about it, we looked at it. Then what are some indicators of development that we can use to compare that which country is more developed and which country is less developed, right? Right? So this is the question that we are moving to. Which indicators should we use? Which indicators of development should we use? Okay. Now, do you guys have any, do you know the answer to this? That what are some commonly used indicators of development? Right? If not, let me tell you. So there are three indicators that we will do as part of our syllabus should be used. Which indicators should we use? So what are good indicators of development? That's the question we are moving towards. Okay. Now, The thing is that the first one that we are about to look at is HDI. HDI stands for Human Development Index. So that is one very commonly used indicator of development. It's also a very simple one, very simple, but still very commonly used. Then another one that we will use is multidimensional poverty index. Multidimensional poverty index, right? I'll write the full form in a bit. And the third and the last type of indicator that we will look at is measurable economic welfare, right? So MEW, measurable economic welfare, right? Okay, so MEW, right? Exactly, great. So let's start off with the first one, that is Human Development Index. Now, to introduce what this index is and who developed this, you guys might be a little surprised to know that this HDI, which is most commonly used index of development, was developed by one Pakistani and one Indian economist, right? So the name of Pakistani economist, I guess, was Mehboob al-Haq, and don't really, to be honest, remember the name of Indian economist, right? So Human Development Index looks at three things. Now this is very interesting. So think about it. So Human Development Index says that there are three basic things that are necessary for development. So as I said, it's also a very simple, index, right? So Human Development Index says that development of a country is mainly based on three pillars or three aspects or three dimensions, whatever you want to call it. One is how much is the income of people living in that country, and I'll see what do we use to calculate income. The other thing that Human Development Index includes in its calculation is education. How much educated and well educated are the citizens of the country. And the third is healthcare. How good is the healthcare facilities in that country? Now, these are the three bases on which a country is evaluated for HDI. So these are the three things on which HDI evaluate a country and then assign a score. I'll tell you how that happens. So for the GDP, think about this, we talked about this. For the income, Human Development Index relies on GDP per capita. What is the basis for this? Students, are you following me? Now, do ask me if there's any question that comes to your mind. So you need to estimate the country's income levels. Right? Now, what you need to do for that is to calculate it some way. How will you calculate it? If you just look at the GDP, is GDP a good indicator for per person? If we are interested in knowing the per person income, then would GDP a good indicator? So why are we using GDP per capita? That's my question. So can anyone of you answer me? Why are we using, right? GDP per capita rather than, GDP, right? So the reason for that is, students, have a look at this. The reason for that is that GDP of a bigger country would obviously be more. So if you calculate the GDP of Pakistan and Bangladesh, okay, now this is interesting. This is where it gets interesting. If you look at the GDP of Pakistan and Pakistan and Bangladesh, which country would have more GDP? Which country would have more GDP, students? Right? Obviously, right? Pakistan. But when you look at the GDP per capita between Pakistan and Bangladesh, Bangladesh and Pakistan, right? Let me also confirm this, right? GDP per capita of Pakistan versus Bangladesh, right? So let's see. So, right. Okay, GDP per capita is 2227. This month, Bangladesh Cabinet Secretary told that GDP per capita in Pakistan per capita GDP is 5.5. And you would be surprised to know that Bangladesh, what I was expecting, Bangladesh per capita income is more than Pakistan, which means that overall Bangladesh, being a smaller country, is not producing as much Pakistan is, but on average, Bangladeshis have higher incomes compared to Pakistan, right? Does it make sense? It's a simple, students, right? No, okay. Now moving forward for the education, what do we look at for the education? To estimate the quality of education, exactly, to estimate the quality of education, it looks at, right, mean years of schooling, right? So it looks at to estimate how good are the education, facilities in a country, mean years of schooling, right? Now, how do we calculate mean years of schooling? Let me also help you here. Mean years of schooling. Think about this. If I say that Pakistan's mean year of schooling is 8 years, now what does that mean? This means that a typical Pakistani, right? Think about this. No, no, education, we do not look at degree holders because degree is a very expensive thing, not every, right? So they spend, if 8 years is Pakistan's mean basically means average, mean years of schooling, right? So if Pakistan's mean years of schooling is 8 years, this means that on average, Pakistanis go to school like formal education, going to school, and formal education, there's a difference between formal and informal education. Formal education is very structured and systematic education. Either you're learning online or you're homeschooled. Even if you're homeschooled, not a problem, but you should be learning in a structure, right? You have subjects, you have dedicated teachers, you get special attention and so on. That is formal education, right? So on average, Pakistanis go to school for 8 years. That is what it means. If for another country, it's 10 years. This means that on average, some people go more than this, some people go less than this. So obviously we know not everyone in Pakistan goes to school for 8 years. You guys have already crossed the average. So if you're doing your A levels, this means that you have already spent 12 years in your formal education. Yes or no? Am I right or wrong? Right? So you guys have already crossed it. But some people are not, they don't go to school at all, or some people just go to school for 1 or 2 years. That's why Pakistan's average is so low. That's why Pakistan's average is so low. Students, are you getting me? It will not be more than, I don't know, I will need to check, but it will not be more than 8 or 9 years, right? Because some people are completely illiterate, like, they never went to school and so on. Okay, now moving on. For the healthcare, what do we use for the healthcare? For the healthcare, we use, in HDI, we use another very simple statistic, that is life expectancy. That is life expectancy. Now, let's look at what life expectancy shows us. Life expectancy shows, if I say that Pakistan's life expectancy is 55 years, and you can all Google these things, right? So these are not something that are unknown. These, statistics, life expectancy, mean years of schooling, right, are very commonly used statistics. So you will easily find for any country, right? Right, and World Bank or United Nations is generally responsible for collecting this data, right? And even if you write Human Development Index for Pakistan, will get a score for that. Okay, now this is that 55 years. This means that a typical Pakistani lives up to 55 years. On average, a typical Pakistani lives up, right, to, right, 55 years. Does it make sense? Right? It's a simple. Any confusion so far? Anything that's coming to your mind? Right. Okay. Great. 67 likes and for education 8 years. Okay, great. So 67. So we are higher on that. Okay, great. But 8 years, I was spot on. Okay, 67 years is the life expectancy, right? Does it make sense? So a typical Pakistani lives up to 67 years. So obviously we know not everyone lives till 67 years. Some obviously die before this, some die after this, but this is the average, right? Easy. Are we good on this? Okay. Now, based on these three calculations, based on GDP per capita, now pay attention. Now, based on GDP per capita, based on mean years of schooling, and based on life expectancy, an overall score is calculated for an economy, right? And it is given a score between 0 to 1. The closer the value it is to 1, this means more developed a country is. So if you Google Pakistan's HDI, so it would be 0.55 something, right? So we are right in the middle. So all the countries that have a value greater than 0.55 show that they are more developed, and all countries that have value of less than 0.55 means that they are less developed. Does it make sense? Students, is this simple? Right? Are we clear on this? Right. Okay. Right. 0.557. Exactly. Great. Perfect. Okay. Now let's move on. So that was one indicator of development. Another indicator of development is known as multi-dimensional poverty index. Another indicator of development is known as multi-dimensional poverty index. Now, this indicator looks at development from a very different lens, multidimensional poverty index. So it is more focusing on that how much is a country's development from poverty perspective, like in simple words, MPI, right? If there is less poverty in a country, this means automatically that the country is more developed. If there's more poverty in a country, this means that the country is less developed. Are you getting me? Right? Now in multidimensional, right? In multi-dimensional poverty index, right? There are a lot of things that you look at to see how developed a country is, right? So that includes, right? Right? So that includes six basic, it includes three things, right? So it includes living standards, three dimensions on which you calculate the development of a country. Now, this is different. Instead of income in the Human Development Index, instead of, think about this. So in this case, Human Development Index, we were using three dimensions. What were those three dimensions? Three aspects. Are you getting me what I mean over here? So Human Development Index was calculating the development of a country based on three aspects: income, education, and healthcare. On the other hand, your multidimensional poverty index replaced income with living standards. So here, instead of income, you have living standards. That's an estimate of your development in the country. Then the second two things stay the same. Education is staying, right? Just like you did in the case of multidimensional poverty index, in the case of Human Development Index, and healthcare also stays, right? Health care. Okay, are we clear on this? Is this simple, right? So in multi-dimensional poverty index, you are estimating the development of a country based on three dimensions. What are those? Living standards 1, education 2, and healthcare 3. Living standards, education, and healthcare, right? Whereas in Human Development Index, you were looking at income, education, and healthcare. Okay, but here's the twist. The statistics that you will use to calculate these three things are different. The statistics that you use in multidimensional poverty index are different. So firstly, starting off, let's say, look at education. Years of schooling, right? Years of schooling. So this is very similar to what we were looking at, right? So in this case, we're using two statistics: years of schooling, right? Just give me a second. Right, just a second. Right, so these indicators are sometimes right. Right. Okay. Now, years of schooling, right, is one of them. So this is the same as we used in the Human Development Index. Average years of schooling. How many years on average a child goes to school? Average years of schooling. Then you have another statistic as well, right? In Human Development Index, there was only one statistic. Students, are you looking at how I'm comparing? So in Human Development Index, there was only one statistic, that was mean years of schooling. In this case, you have average years of schooling. It's exactly the same. It's just the wording. Either you say mean years or average years, it's the same thing, right? And another statistic that you will use in multidimensional poverty index is school attendance, right? School enrollment rates. School enrollment rates basically tells you what? Let me tell you. So if the school enrollment of Pakistan is, you can also Google it and you'll get to find out, 55%. Now, what does this mean? Now, listen to this very carefully. So out of all the children, out of all kids who should be in schools, what percentage of children are actually in school? Students, are you getting me? So if, according to even the Constitution of Pakistan, right? So it states responsibility to provide free and compulsory education to all. Free and compulsory, right? education to all. So primary and secondary user schooling is compulsory in all the countries of the world, right? Most of the countries, right? So 55% school enrollment means that only 55% of the total student body is actually in school. Only 55% of the actual, right? 55% of the actual student body who should be in schools are in schools. How many of you got this? So out of 100 kids on average, 55 go to school and the remaining 45 don't go to school. They're not even enrolled in schools. That's what it means. Students, are you getting me? Is this making sense? Right? Is this making sense? If there's any confusion, please ask me, right? So school enrollment shows what percentage, and if you're having problem with this, I can also write the definitions after this, but first try to understand this. So school enrollment means what percentage of school going children are actually in school, right? So higher the school enrollment, the better it is. Higher the school enrollment, the better it is. Okay. Now for the healthcare, you also have two statistics, right? What are the two statistics? Percentage of malnourishment, right? Now, if you have heard the word before, right? Let me write this down over here. Malnutrition, right? So malnutrition is basically when someone is not receiving enough nutrition that is needed on, based on his or her age and so on, right? Exactly. So if you're malnourished, as the term goes, this means that you are not healthy because you're not getting enough adequate nutrition, food, and so on that you need, right? So if there is a higher percentage of people who are malnourished in a country, this means that the state of healthcare is poor, right? Those people cannot afford food, basic food, and so on, which is obviously bad. Okay, now another indicator of healthcare that you use is child mortality, right? What percentage of newborn child mortality? Mortality means death, right? What percentage of newborns die? So if child mortality, let's say, giving you a random number, is 5% in Pakistan, this means out of 100 children that are born in a country, 5%, 5 kids do not survive. 5 kids do not survive. They, die in very young age. Students, are you getting me? So that is child mortality. So if child mortality is high, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If child mortality is high, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right? So obviously that should be a bad thing, right? Are we getting this? Right, because of, there are a couple of things. So healthcare is not that good. We do not have very advanced ways of, sometimes the children, there will always be some sort of child mortality, but it should not be very high. So the reason why child mortality is high can be because of, right, we do not have good healthcare. There are not enough hospitals. Children do not get better, proper medical treatment, right? And things like that. Okay, now moving on to the living standards. Now on living standards, we look at three things, right? So percentage of people having access to clean drinking water, right? Who have access to clean drinking water, right? So obviously that's a very, very basic, thing to have. Clean drinking water, right? So if people have access to clean drinking water, obviously that's the more percentage has access to clean drinking water, the better, obviously, right? Okay, then another thing that they look at is the same percentage of people having access to electricity, right? So we take electricity for granted, right? In fact, how about it is taking us more space? So I will write down the 6 indicators. So there are 6 statistics that we use to calculate the living standards, and I will be writing all of that on the next slide, right? Okay, so for living standards, you have, for the living standards, you have 6 statistics, which includes, right, percentage of people who have access to clean drinking water, percentage of people who have access to electricity, clean drinking water, drinking water, percentage of population who have access to, with access to electricity, right? Then you want to look at, right, quality of, you know, similarly, percentage of people with access to proper sanitation, facilities. That's another very basic need, right? And then you have, right, necessity of facilities, right? Then you have the type of cooking fuel that they use. Now, why is this important? Let me write this down first and then I'll tell you. Type of cooking fuel that is being used, right? What percentage, and even in this, they look at what percentage are using, you know, basic fuels like cow dung and so on and so forth, right? Then you have asset ownership and quality of housing, right? So these are the 6 statistics that you use quality of housing to determine. These are the 6 statistics that you use to determine, you know, how high are the living standards in a country. Okay, now let me explain you, right, exactly. Why do we need to provide this much detail like these 6 steps? Okay, now that's a good question. Students, come back. Let's quickly try to wrap this up. Now, Human Development Index, if you remember when I explained this, I said that Human Development Index is commonly used and yet it is very simple. Now, Human Development Index is also calculating the development of a country on 3 dimensions, on 3 aspects. So according to Human Development Index, development of a country is based on these 3 most important things. What are these 3 most important things? How much is the income of a country? How good are the education facilities in a country, and how good are the healthcare facilities in a country, right? Easy? Is it simple? Okay. Same goes for multidimensional poverty index, right? It is also calculating the development of a country on 3 aspects or 3 dimensions: living standards, education, and healthcare. But to get a better idea and to better differentiate between countries, Isha, to get a better idea, more detailed idea, and to get, you know, to better differentiate between countries, the more the data you have, the more the statistics you have, right, the easier it would be to differentiate between countries, that what exactly is the difference between these countries in terms of development, right? So that is why multidimensional poverty index uses 2 statistics: average years of schooling for education and school enrollment, right? Similarly, in healthcare, they use 2 statistics: percentage of malnutrition and child mortality, right? You do understand what statistic is. Statistic is anything that you're calculating, any value, any number, right? And then for the living standards, they don't use income like Human Development Index that uses income to estimate the development. They don't, this this indicator doesn't use income, but instead it uses living standards. And within living standards, there are so many indicators, 6 indicators. Why? 6 statistics. Why? So that you get a more detailed description. Percentage of people who have access to clean drinking water. So clean drinking water is one thing. Then you have people who have access to electricity. That's another very important thing. People who have access to sanitation facilities. That's also a very important thing, right? Then you have, you know, type of cooking fuel, right? If they're using, you know, very basic type of fuel like cow dung and so on and so forth, right? That shows poor level of development. Then what is the asset ownership? How many households own a basic motorbike or a bicycle? These are the things that they look at. And the quality of housing, in the sense that the house is permanent, like made of cement and so on, or is it something made out of mud and so on. So these are all the 6 statistics that you calculate to estimate the living standards, right? Slums and so on. Exactly, right? Are we clear on this? Okay, so students, will stop here for today. Tomorrow, if you have any questions regarding these 2, I'll clarify before we move on to the third and the last type of indicator. That is measurable economic welfare, right? And then we'll try to sum all these things up, and then I'll also tell you what type of questions are asked on the exam, so that we can better prepare and better think about what are the points that need to be included if such a question arises, right?